The relationship between the demigods and the demons is one that we repeatedly find discussed in the Srimad Bhagavatam. And it is a central part of understanding also the way in which the Lord organized this material world. In the beginning of the 7th canto, we see that the question raised by Maharaj Parikshit was, how is it that the Lord appears to be partial towards the demigods? We see just before that, in the end of the 6th canto, it is explained how the Lord had killed during the yajna of Maharaj Yudhisthira. He killed Shishupal after Shishupal had cursed and blasphemed him. And we see the Lord has at many times, it seems like he sides with the demigods and he fights against the demons. And Parikshit Maharaj was asking, this doesn't, in one sense, it doesn't make sense, because the Lord is supposed to be equal to everyone. If the Lord becomes partial, if God is partial to one person and not to another, that is something we generally consider as a fault. Like we all are involved in different kind of organizations, so we all know how angry we get if you're part of an organization and your boss is obviously favoring some other person. You see that partiality is generally something we don't like it so much, because it is definitely something. It is a flaw, a character flaw in one sense, and it takes real, one could say, really very serious leadership. It takes a lot of serious leadership ability to be not subjected to this flaw of partiality. If you've ever had the opportunity to be in a leadership position, you will know how difficult it is to balance out, to be fair towards everyone. Even once you have children, it's also very interesting, because then that also the same principle is there. You have to be so careful with your kids so that your kids don't feel that you love one more than the other. Then there can also be great drama. So the principle of partiality, then Maharaj Parikshit was saying that it is a flaw, but the Lord seems to be so partial towards the demigods. It seems like he is always helping them and, in one sense, fighting them against the demons. So how do we understand this principle? So then the whole 7th canto was discussed, but the general answer that was given is to understand that really the Lord organizes this world according to the influence of the 3 modes of material nature. So the world is basically designed in a specific way. The world is designed in such a way that if you act in a certain way, you will be favored. You will move up. And once you stop acting in that way, if you act in another way, then the world will just push you down. You will just get into trouble. And even though it looks like the Lord personally is favoring the demigods and against the demons, that's not really the case, because anyone who has some contact with God will be benefited. There's no way in which any kind of association or connection that you experience with God, as a demigod or a demon, as someone who is averse to God, or as someone who is trying to at least follow God, any contact is favorable. We see then that is the example that is given in Krishna. So many of these individuals that Krishna have killed, apparently, like Shishupal, for example, he chopped off his head in the middle of the assembly. But at the same time, Shishupal attained liberation. So you see that anybody who has some contact with God, it is favorable. And we also hear, I heard a story the other day of a man who once, there's a lady who was a book distributor, and she was distributing books on a train station. And this man came and she tried to distribute this book to him. And he just got so upset with her. This is a Spanish man. I think it happened somewhere in Europe. And he's a Spanish businessman, and he somehow just flipped and he lost it. And he took the book, and he basically took the book and he tore it in half. And he pushed the lady, he pushed her over, and she actually fell, and she hurt. I don't know if she broke her arm, but she really fell bad. And she was, just really bad. It was like a really bad scene. And he just stormed off onto the train and he went home. And but he still had that book with him. So he sort of ripped up the book, but somehow he kept the book with him. He didn't throw it away. And then the book ended up in his bag or something, and then he went home. the book sort of, his wife, or what happened is that when he went home, he had a servant, a maid. So the maid, she found this book. So she thought, oh, so there's something wrong with the book. So she fixed the book up sort of, a little bit, and, taped it up, and then she put it on the bookshelf, because that's what, she was just sort of thinking that she's supposed to do. So this book ended up on this guy's bookshelf. Then a few years later, or I don't know how long, a certain while later, this man's wife, she got a serious disease, a terminal disease, and she died from cancer, and it was very traumatic for him. And then, one day he was sitting at home, and I think he was even contemplating to commit suicide. He was just so crushed. But then he somehow saw this book. He saw this book in his bookshelf. He pulled the book out and he started to read it. And then he couldn't stop. So then for 2 days he took off from work, and then for 2 days he just sat at home and he was just reading this book. Just read this book the whole time. And then he realized what he had done. And then he went to this closest ISKCON temple. So he went to the temple, and then he just knocked on the door. When they opened the door, he just offered his obeisances. And then he started to just ask the leaders there if he just wants to do some service. He basically wanted to surrender. And they were like thinking, wow, amazing, because at that time they didn't have like a lot of professional people come. It's more of like, it's more of like a little bit of a wilder community. But this guy comes, just like a very successful businessman, and he's fully surrendered, and he's very sincere. So they were a little bit shocked. So they asked him, what is his story? And then he told them the story. And then he, at the end, he moved into the temple, and he became their treasurer. Like, he's the one who really helped them to sort out their finances and all these things. He was a professional person from a professional background. And I guess it's one of those amazing stories. It doesn't happen every day. But we see the principle was that the person, even though he himself was very averse, he was very averse and very violent, somehow he had contact. He had contact with Krishna, and he was still benefited. So that is the principle of how we have to understand that Krishna is ultimately impartial, meaning that whoever contacts him benefits. Now, at the same time, that's the sort of the spiritual level of the situation. But when it comes to the organization of material affairs, things are set up in such a way that, in general, it is only those who are willing to follow God's instructions that will be able to, one could say, keep a hold of things, keep things together in the material world. We see a few instances in the Bhagavatam where the demigods or the demons attain the upper hand. So we see this in the 6th canto of the Bhagavatam, we see it again in the 8th, where somehow due to their offenses, generally it's due to offending the spiritual master. The demigods, we have to understand, they are not pure devotees. So they accept the supremacy of God, definitely accept the supremacy of God. They in general strive to follow the authority of God and to follow God's instructions. But, sometimes, as they say, there is a slip between the cup and the lip. Sometimes, generally it is due to pride. We would see oftentimes the demigods, because they live in such great opulence, they can easily be afflicted by pride. And then they somehow commit some offenses, usually against the brahmanas or against the spiritual master. And then for a moment, the protection of God becomes retracted, or the protection that comes from the mode of goodness, one could even say, it is retracted. And then it looks like the demons, they get the upper hand for a while. But we see that once when the demigods approached God, or Lord Brahma, after the demons had taken sort of hold of the situation, then it was explained that it is due to the influence of time that now those who are in the mode of passion are favored. But one has to just wait, because the modes of nature are always shifting. And very soon again, it will be that those who are in the mode of goodness, they will be favored. Because that is the plan of God, that the modes of nature are always shifting, and that keeps everyone on their toes, one could say. So here we are seeing specifically how the demons had now attained the upper hand because of the demigods who had made a mess a little bit again. But we see that Bali, even though he would be, at the moment, he conquered the heavenly kingdoms, very soon it would go down again because of because by the Lord's arrangement. Now, when we speak about the demigods and the demons, it's sort of, it's very metaphysical. But we can see it even playing out now within the modern world itself. So we have to understand that demigods means those who are in the mode of goodness. Demons means those who are predominated by the mode of passion. And ignorance is basically those who are, that's also considered to be the Rakshasas. So that's the third class of beings in general, who are then people that are predominated by ignorance. So these three modes are there in the world. So it's not abstract, it's not something metaphysical with the demons having their horns and tails and forked tongues. No, it is about a certain state of consciousness that people have, a certain mentality that people maintain within the world. And that mentality is then what puts one into one of these different categories. At the moment, we see our society, it is made in such a way that those who are passionate, they will be rising to the top. That is a fact. And nowhere else it is more a fact than in New York City. I spoke to my one friend yesterday, he was saying how he works for the city, and they get really good health care, and they got all kinds of benefits. But the one thing in his job is they only get 1 sick leave per year, 1 day sick leave per year. Amazing, only 1 day. And I don't even know how that's legal, but he says that it's very heavy, so it means that you can never, you can't, if you want to take leave, they aren't going to pay you. I mean, 1 day, and then even leave, you have sick leave 1 day and leave 1 week a year. So if you want to take off, and the problem is if you take off too much, then they might end up firing you because city jobs are in high demand. So we see that those who are really interested in getting money, they are favored by the modern society. So because they're willing to work very, very hard and even sacrifice their health and so many other things for that purpose. So it is difficult then for those who are more inclined to the mode of goodness, those who have other priorities also, priorities that not necessarily generate money, and they want to make that also part of their life, like for example devotional service or certain other wholesome activities. The process of bhakti yoga is ultimately not something that will necessarily bring you tons of money. So we see that the modern world is structured in such a way that it is favoring those who are motivated by personal profit. They can work much harder and they can tolerate more easily what the society throws at them. But we see that it is just a temporary situation. It's a temporary situation. And we see that the Lord, he always advises the demigods, or whether it's Lord Brahma or Lord Vishnu, he always advises the demigods that you simply continue sticking to the principles. Stick to your principles, even though now it might look that things are very difficult and that society is not very favorable to what you're trying to do. But stick to your principles. Stick to the principles of what you know is really good and what you know is really true. Because the world is always changing. Things shift. And if you can maintain your dedication towards the principles of spirituality, even though it might be very difficult, you will in the end rise to the top. At least you will attain success. And even in society now, how even though society is so wild, so many things are now also becoming part of society. Vegetarianism, for example, we see at a certain point. I know one devotee, Shivaram Swami, when he went vegetarian in in the early 1970s, his parents sent him to a psychologist. He had to go for a psychological assessment because it was just so radical. To become vegetarian they never met vegetarian in their life, and they were so freaked out by the idea. So how far even we see as society gone? And the question is, how much actually has the Hare Krishna movement contributed to this? Much more than we might think. Social change is one of those things that people don't, it's difficult to keep a tab of who did what in terms of changing society, because society changes very slowly and it changes by the gradual introduction of new ideas and new behaviors. And then these things become normal. And that's how society changes, but it takes a while. Like now, for example, to be a vegetarian is super normal. I mean, you can be in any big corporation, even in any normal place. You can say you're a vegetarian. Even if the president of the United States would be a vegetarian, it wouldn't be such a shock. It wouldn't be like people freak out. So we see that it's become normal. So in that way, society is shifting quite a bit. There's also some good happening, and society is shifting. So therefore, the principle that we see in the Bhagavatam is that simply stick to your principles. Stick to the principles of what God has announced. And even though it sometimes might be difficult and sometimes might be easy, at the end, God is ultimately still in control. And the general norm is that society is better run. Society is ultimately meant to be run by those who are godly. The big distinction then that was made between, in the 16th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, we see that Krishna explains both the demoniac mentality and the demigodly mentality. So it really is a meditation. That chapter is very important to meditate on regularly, because it is explained in Kali Yuga, in previous yugas, the demons and the demigods, they lived in different universes. And then in the next yuga, they lived on different planets. And then in the next yuga, they live in different countries. And in this yuga, they live in the same person. So the demigods and the demons, they're in one person. So we ourselves find ourselves a little split. We're all a little bit schizophrenic to a certain extent, where we have these two parts of our psychology. And both of them can be quite strong. We can sometimes be so devotionally inclined, like the tears can come from your eyes, or you can perform devotional service and you can be so, you can just relish the principle of being a servant. Or sometimes you can, feel such a flood of humility, and you offer your obeisances, and really it's just so sincerely. And then the next moment something happens, something ticks you off, and your claws come out and your fangs start to grow, and you just somehow become overwhelmed by hatred or resentment or anger, such a heavy, intense emotional experiences. And that is just the reality in Kali Yuga, is that we have this mixed bag. Our conditioning is so mixed, but both things coming together. So by looking at the 16th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, we really, we see ourselves reflected there, both sides, both the demigod and the divine mentality is there. But at the end, Krishna gives the basic distinction between the demigod and the demon. And that is that the demigods, or the godly individuals, they are willing to follow the advice of God. They're willing to follow the instructions of God. That desire to be willing to follow authority, following those who know, that is what ultimately distinguishes the divine from the demoniac, because that is really how one obtains God's protection. The material world is very complicated. So it means that, just like we see here, even sometimes the demons can be apparently favored, and they can think that things are working now in their favor. But it's not really in the ultimate end going to be like that. It's going to end bad. Everything is going to collapse that they construct, because it's built on the mode of passion. So the world is made in such a way that it confuses us. It confuses individuals. It's very complicated to understand what is the right way to act to obtain your own happiness. So therefore, but it is designed, it is made like that. It is made to be confusing. It is not an accident. It is a part of the design, because the complexity of the material world is made to first give certain people the facility to do what they want to, even though it won't end well. So to give them that freedom to do things that are not really wholesome, but still they have to be able to do it, because it's also meant, the material world is meant to facilitate a certain kind of freedom. But on the other hand, it's also made in such a way that those individuals who are willing to follow instruction, who are willing to take good guidance, they're the only ones who will be able to see the path to traverse through the world. So therefore, Krishna makes the distinction. Yeah, there's those individuals who are willing to conduct their lives according to the principles of Shastra, who are willing to listen to Shastra and imbibe that and act according to that, even though it might be sometimes a little challenging. They will ultimately become divine. They will be divinely protected, divinely inspired, and also divinely empowered. At a certain point, they will be the ones that will also be naturally gravitate towards having an influence in the world. So very interesting that we have to do this. And it is then something that we all have to practice. We see that there's so much energy or attention in the modern world going into the principle of leadership, trying to teach people how to become leaders. So everybody is a leader, and we have leadership colleges and leadership courses, and if you and universities or colleges, they would say, yes, the purpose of our institution is to create leaders, to generate leaders of society. And it's nice, we do need leaders. Are wonderful, we love leaders, and leaders are important. But I was reading this interesting letter by Prabhupada. Prabhupada is saying, he said they're making a complaint, there's some complaints about one of his leaders, and then Prabhupada says, but how can he be a good leader if there are no good followers? It's like, how can, it takes two to tango, meaning that just like you need to learn how to be a leader, you also need to learn, it's a skill to learn how to be able to follow, to learn how to be able to work under instruction or under guidance. It's not easy. It takes some practice. It is also a skill. There's a whole art towards it. It has to be done with finesse. It requires a lot of intelligence. Some people think that being a follower or a servant means you can switch off your intelligence and you just become a robot and you just follow, and then you don't have to think for yourself. But that is really not at all how it works. The same amount of intelligence that is required to be a leader, that same amount of intelligence is required to be an adequate follower, to really be a supportive follower, or to be someone that has the ability to take guidance and instruction and then to apply it intelligently into your life with sincerity. It really is a big trick. And that is then something that is not oftentimes taught to us. So we have to learn both. Even if you are a leader, you have to also learn how to be able to follow, because it is by being a follower that you one day become empowered to become a leader. And that is such a fascinating thing about how spiritual knowledge also spreads within this world. If you look at the idea of the Guru Parampara, who becomes a guru? Who is the guru? It is he who is the best disciple. That person who is the best disciple, he becomes a guru. If one is an adequate disciple, then one will become empowered to be a guru. That's the only people that can really take positions of leadership within this world, is those who understand that even if I take supposed position of leadership, that I stay a follower, I still am everybody is ultimately subordinated to God. So therefore, we see that even if those who are demoniac, those who have this asuric mentality, even if they do obtain a position of leadership, that position itself will destroy them, because that position will bewilder them. They will become proud of that position because they're not able to always understand that they are really meant, they stay servants, they stay followers. So very interesting how that comes out again and again in this Bhagavatam, how the demigods, even if they sometimes make mistakes, and even if sometimes things apparently are not going so well for them, the thing that they always keep is they keep that natural tendency to try to take shelter of God and to try to understand what to do based on superior guidance. So it is really that mentality that will keep us connected. It is that mentality that will allow us to move through all the various complexities of life in a wholesome way, even if we have shortcomings. So that also has to be understood. Shortcomings are natural. I was reading today this wonderful pastime in the 4th chapter of the Bhagavatam, where Dhruva, actually read the purport, I have it right here, where Dhruva, he started to, when his brother was killed, then his brother was killed by this tribe in the Himalayas, so he went there to avenge the death of his brother. Because he was a king, it was also important for him to do that. And then there's this amazing purport. I'll read it to you quickly. Okay, so when Dhruva heard of the killing of his brother, he was overwhelmed with lamentation and anger. And he got on his chariot and he went out for victory over the Yakshas. And the Prabhupada says, Dhruva Maharaj, becoming angry, overwhelmed with grief, and envious of the enemy, was not incompatible with his position as a great devotee. It is a misunderstanding that the devotee should not be angry, envious, or overwhelmed by lamentation. What a what a mouthful. It was really such a shock to read this. So meaning that what makes us divine, what keeps us connected to divinity, is not the absence of what we can say to be purported shortcomings or human characteristics, like sometimes becoming overwhelmed or sometimes becoming angry. That's not the real qualifying feature. That's not the real thing that distinguishes even the devoted from the non-devoted. The real feature that distinguishes us is the desire, one could say, sincere desire to want to know what does God want, and to be willing to take that desire and to take that advice and to somehow do one's best to implement it in life. And it is, if one is the great fortune, one could say, of becoming a devotee or becoming a spiritual person, is simply that mentality, that faith, that this will help. If one is able, if the consciousness opens up to that potential of being willing to be inspired by the advice of divine people, you don't understand how rare that is. And you see, we sometimes feel, yes, we have so many shortcomings, and I'm struggling so much in spiritual life, and I struggle to do this, and sometimes I can't get up in the morning, and sometimes, all this variety of things that we might feel, and then we feel that, wow, will I ever be able to make it? But I tell you that just the fact that you have this willingness to be willing to to imbibe Krishna's instruction in your life, that is so glorious. That is such a glorious position to be in. Something very, very rare, and something that has taken us millions of lives to come to that point. We were willing to open our heart up to this possibility, and through seeing how Krishna deals with the demigods and the demons, it's supposed to also inspire us to see that in the end, even though our life can go through various courses, it is God's protection is always there for those who are willing to listen. And at the end of the 18th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, he says that Machita sarva durgani mat prasada terishasi atachepam ahankaran nashroshyasi. He says that those who are willing to listen, those who are conscious of him and listening to his instructions, they will overcome all the obstacles of conditioned life by his grace. But to those who cannot hear him, because of the false ego, they will be lost. So very interesting how this principle is of trying to hear Krishna's instruction, hear God's desire through our intelligence, is really at the crux of the process of devotional service. And it all starts by coming to Bhagavatam class. So all of us have already attained, just by being here, we've already made wonderful progress in becoming a divinely inspired person. So congratulations to everyone here. I'm only here because they invited me, and otherwise, for me also, this is what gets me to Bhagavatam class. So we're all here together, trying to become divinely inspired, and it is very glorious. So let us hear if we have any questions or any comments from the illustrious members of the audience on something that has been said today.
Thank you so much, Guru. I had a quick question. The Brahmanas give Bali Maharaj this power.
Yes.
And it reminds me of Hiranyakashipu and Lord Brahma also giving him that power. This seems like you maybe think they must have the foresight to see, well, this person could probably misuse this power. And the Brahmanas are also, in relating it back to your point of leadership, like Lord Brahma and the Brahmanas, pretty good leaders. But these things happen where they bestow some kind of benediction, and then these terrible things happen. Yeah. So I guess, why would they do that? And then also how, obviously they are qualified to be leaders. So how do we not judge, we don't want to criticize Brahmanas or Lord Brahma.
Yeah, we don't want to do that. That we definitely don't want to do. Okay, well, two things. Firstly, you mentioned the pastime of Hiranyakashipu and then also this specific pastime. And two things I have to mention. Firstly, there is also two different kinds of brahmanas in this world. So the basic principle in the material world is if you follow authority, then you can move forward, even for material desire. If you're willing to listen and learn, then you can make it in life. And even we see that people who become materially successful, they have that. Stubborn people, they get destroyed very quickly. It is those people that are willing to learn and to listen and to hear, even if it is for the obtaining of their own material desires, they move forward. And we see that in this world, there's two kinds of brahmanas. Even we see that in this specific pastime, when Bali Maharaj is sitting there, you have two brahmanas. The one is his spiritual master, who is, what's his name? Shukra Acharya. And he is a brahmana, but he's a materialistic brahmana. Shukra Acharya even means a person who, Shukra means semen. So Prabhupada points to this one Prabhupada that it is a seminal brahmana, meaning someone who takes his position on the basis of birth. So a materialistic brahmana, a brahmana nonetheless, who gave him wonderful instruction. He gave him such instruction to the point that he could take over the heavenly kingdom. So it worked. So, but then on the other hand, you had Vamanadev, who was, one could say, a spiritual brahmana, a little brahmana who wasn't interested in giving material benediction, but was interested in giving spiritual benediction. So therefore, we see also these two kinds of brahmanas, and it depends on your desire who you're going to follow. But if you follow the brahmanas, you will have success. Even if you want material success, you have to find a brahmana who can give you the knowledge that you need to be materially successful. So therefore, that's one point. The point with Hiranyakashipu is interesting because that was a little different. That was, Lord Brahma was there. He's not a materialistic brahmana, a great saintly individual, but he was forced. See, he was forced by the rules of the material energy to do something that he didn't really want to do. He had to give Hiranyakashipu a benediction to appease him. So by brute power of determination, Hiranyakashipu forced a certain result in the material world, even though Lord Brahma wasn't particularly inclined to give it to him. But what could he do? He was not, somehow Hiranyakashipu had basically overpowered him. So that also sometimes has to be understood, that material leaders who are appointed leaders, sometimes they will encounter difficulties that is above their pay grade, that they just cannot actually deal with. And therefore, we as followers sometimes have to be willing to accept that, to understand that, our leaders, they are not God. They cannot actually solve all the problems. Sometimes certain situations arise that is just out of their ability to control. Then they try their best. That's what Brahma did. Hiranyakashipu is basically going to destroy the whole world. It was generating so much heat. So then Brahma said, well, I have to do something. And then he said, okay, let me give him a benediction. And at least I pacify the immediate situation. And then we have to hope that Krishna can help us deal with the consequences. So that sometimes has to be there. So we have to be willing to sometimes be patient and understanding. The first principle of being a good follower is this wonderful class by Devamrita Swami. He did it for the GBC strategic planning team. It's on YouTube. That is a whole series of lectures on devotee care. And he gave this class on caring for leaders. And he had these 5 principles that if you want to help your leaders, there's these 5 things that you can do. And the first one is called empathy, meaning to really understand the position of a leader, to understand that they can't actually solve all the problems. They're trying their best, but any person you will encounter things that's just you can't do it. You'll be encountered with certain things, and then the best that the leaders can do is they can try to sort of deal with it or do the best they can, but they can't solve it. So that, I think, is a very important first principle. Do not put unrealistic burden on our leadership, and see that sometimes the best they can do is the best that they can do. And then we have to be willing to support them and accept that beyond them is also Krishna. See, that's the thing, because Krishna is ultimately in control of everything. And if there's an apparent obstacle that happens that the leadership cannot even deal with, then the devotee has to understand, well, somehow now this is Krishna's desire. He is above these people even. And we have to take it in that spirit. And in that way, there can actually be very nice synergy between the leaders and the people. And the interesting thing is, if leaders get more support, then they actually become empowered to deal with more heavier issues. So if people are more supportive of leadership, then the leadership can actually deal better with many more situations, versus that if you become very demanding and very unreasonable of leadership, then the leadership will be able to do less. Then actually it is more difficult for them to do something, and you will actually also suffer. So interesting, how everybody gets their due. Is that okay? Let's answer the question.
Yes, thank you, Prabhu. Very comprehensive answer.